Welcome to Rappahannock Issues. I'm Tom Coen.
And I'm David Kerr.
And we're going to be looking at topics that are of interest to our community, both regionally and to the state. Welcome to Rappahannock Issues. I'm Tom Coen. Important election is coming up in November, less than 60 days away, the presidential election. And we're here with our power panel, which we're glad to have once again. And so we're going to look into this election and what's going to be coming up as we head towards it. So with our power panel, we have Dr. Stephen Farnsworth from the University of Mary Washington. We have Deidre Condit, who is the doctor over at Virginia Commonwealth University. And we have David Kerr, my co-host on the show. And so let's get into it. What are your impressions? We'll start with you, Stephen. What's your feeling as we head into the final stretch of the campaign?
Well, mainly my feeling is, when is this going to be over? I think that this has been a really unpleasant campaign in that everything that everybody says is very critical of somebody else. Normally, you look at presidential campaigns and you see at least some optimism here and there, some vision for the future, some idea about how America can be better. But what you have is this competing cycle of gloom and doom and personal attack that I think really is going to make people more cynical about politics than they already are. And they start out pretty cynical.
Deidre, want to add to that happy note?
I would actually sadly echo it. I just yesterday was saying to somebody, I will be the happiest person on the planet possibly on November 9th. But I think that one of the things that's so interesting to me as a political scientist is trying to understand this election. Because all of the data on the ground gives us one clear picture of what the outcome of this election ought to be. It's the first election, really, Obama started it, but this election is being driven by one side doing significant data mining, and the other side, as near as we can tell, doing no campaigning in any real traditional sense. So it's a stark contrast. And we political scientists are trying to figure out, if we understand what we traditionally think is going to happen in an election, the predictors that we have developed are actually going to be useful, or if in fact we're through the looking glass this time around.
Right. David?
Well, this is it's hard to disagree with anything you've said, because you've captured it very well. And you do see one side mining the data, really working the polls, really pulling data, going out and canvassing hard, collecting data, calling, getting out there, vote, and identifying it. But I think of I'm going off on a trip to England actually tomorrow, and I think of an election back at about 5 years ago when they said, where did all these closet Tories come from? Labour was winning the election back in 1992. It's been a few years, and then all at once it was a pretty solid Conservative win. And I just kind of wonder if people aren't quite telling all that's going on in their minds about this election. And in Virginia, go back a few years to King Cuccinelli and Terry McAuliffe. That should have been a much wider gap. Now, there are various reasons why it wasn't, but I felt like people weren't quite telling the whole story to the pollsters. And then looking at Mark Warner, Mark, not John, and that was another one where it was a double-digit lead, easy, didn't even worry about it. I think Mark was getting worried at the end because he wasn't seeing people acting the way the polls were telling him they should be acting. But nonetheless, we were at what turned out to be one of the closer, not the closest by any means, but one of the closer elections in Virginia history. I have this uneasy feeling that nobody's getting it at this point.
Well, and it's sort of tagging on that, is that pollsters will go into it with a certain predicate, with a certain mindset of what they're expecting, because they have to use some barometer or some parameters of when they're making the phone calls and doing their data, and especially with so many people on not having landlines anymore, they're doing mathematical formulas to sort of figure this out, and that's sort of an interesting element of how much of that is their preconceived notion. For a long time, it was that the Republicans are demoralized; they're not going to come out at all, or they're not going to come out for Trump. So therefore, they weren't calling traditional Republicans, and they're like, the Northern Virginia is really excited, so they're overcalling Northern Virginia, but then the latest polls seem to be closer in Virginia, and so it's interesting. The other thing that strikes me is just the media in its openly hostility towards Trump, and that and the Republicans have long said the mainstream media is against them, and now it's like they don't care that they're obvious. I mean, they have anchors; they're saying it's their job to make him be defeated. The front of the New York Times had a columnist that they put on the front of the newspaper saying, that is our goal, to defeat Trump, and it just seems really interesting that the media is taking a stand, which those of us in academia say, when we know people teach journalism, and that's sort of the number one rule of journalism, is you're supposed to be impartial, and yet, I mean, almost everything that is so blatantly viewed, and even Fox News this year isn't even going to help Trump.
I would actually disagree with that, Tom. I think that there's actually a big body of data that shows Hillary Clinton has received more negative coverage in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, and in the mainstream broadcast media outlets than Trump has. There's actually the data that shows that. But what we're seeing, what makes it feel like the mainstream media is attacking Trump, is that they have now created this notion of false equivalency. And so if the Clinton campaign does X, immediately it turns around in the media that in order to maintain a kind of horse race mentality, Trump did Y. And so I think the voters really don't have any sense of policy. There's no discussion of policy on either side. There's no discussion of sort of how the election is going to impact people's lives in any meaningful way. And we don't really have a sense of truth. We are in, as people now call it, the post-fact era. And so I don't think that it's just Trump. If you talk to people on the ground in the Clinton campaign, they are furious that she can't get her message out no matter how hard she tries. And so when you hear it from both sides, that tells you probably ought to look at sort of what the method is of transmitting it. And as we sit here on the media, right, it's hard for us to sort of think that through, but we don't have anybody critiquing the media unless it's coming from academia, and that often usually takes time.
Right, or it's from a certain bias that they're critiquing the media.
Well, it's important to remember, I think, that the perhaps the most dangerous media bias is actually towards the trivial. I mean, I think it's fair to criticize the media for these individual incidents that we can all point to that were problematic, and it's also fair, I think, to criticize the candidates because they are really offering up a very policy-thin conversation, particularly Trump, who doesn't have an experience in policy and doesn't have a record one can rely on. But it's also important to remember that these are for-profit businesses. And if we wanted more substantive news, it would be provided to us. And so, look in the mirror if you don't like the news.
Right, and we have less than 30 seconds left. And that's sort of the mindset is that the public is supposedly clamoring for something, but then again, we want to watch Dancing with the Stars and see Ryan Lochte be protested again. And it would be a horrible thing for you to dance away from us and not come back after this break to hear more about the 2016 election. So come back to Rappahannock Issues.